Okay, tonight you guys are going to be focusing on some multiplication properties. Before we get into the lesson, let's quickly go over your multiplication and division rules for integers. And to back up a bit, we've done addition. We had war and get mugged twice. We've done subtraction, where we had type 1 and type 2. There are 8 rules total. Those are 4 of them. The other 4 are the multiplication and division rules, which we can do here really quickly. So we're just going to briefly write these down. You'll remember all of this from elementary school. So this works for both multiplication and division. First one, we know that a positive times a positive equals a positive number. Right? So for example, if we had a positive 3 times a positive 5, we would end up with a positive 15. And that's no surprise. Okay? The next one would be a negative times a negative. And you guys remember that a negative times a negative is what? Well, it also gives you a positive number. Remember, that's very different from get mugged twice. With addition, a negative plus a negative is a larger negative number. But with multiplication, a negative times a negative gives you a positive. So for example, if we had a negative 3 times a negative 5, that would produce a positive 15. So when dealing with just two numbers, signs being the same, you're going to end up with a positive answer. And then we have our mixes. So a positive times a negative produces a negative. So if we had a positive 3 times a negative 5, that would give us a negative 15. And we could also switch that around. If we had a negative first times a positive, that would also produce a negative. So if we began with the negative 3 and multiplied it by the positive 5, we'd still end up with a negative number. And I used multiplication here, but you could also do this with division. A positive divided by a positive would be a positive. A negative divided by a negative would be a positive. A positive divided by a negative would be a negative. And a negative divided by a positive would be a negative number. Tonight you're mainly going to focus on multiplication though. Okay? So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, it says when an even number of negatives are multiplied, the result is a positive number. If there are an odd number of negatives multiplied, the result is a negative number. And let's just take a quick look at what we're talking about here. So, most of your problems in this lesson are going to be more than 2 numbers. So let's see what happens. Here we have 3 numbers. Negative 2 times positive 4 times negative 3. Well, the reason that turns out to be a positive when you multiply those out is because you're looking at 2 negative numbers in the mix. Okay. Another example. Here we also have 3 numbers. All 3 of them are negative, so we have an odd number of negative numbers. So a negative times a negative would produce a negative. Okay, so if it's an even number of negatives, you're going to end up with a positive number. If it's an odd number of negatives, you're going to end up with a negative number. All right, now when exponents get involved, here both of these examples are trapped inside parentheses. So it says quantity negative 4 to the 4th power. Just remember, we are talking about negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4 when we see the parentheses like that. And notice that there are 4 negatives involved, and since 4 is an even number, remember that an even number of negatives will produce a positive number answer, okay, if we are multiplying. Okay. In the next example, we have negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. And that's 3 negative numbers, so that's an odd number of negatives. And remember that an odd number of negatives will produce a negative number answer. Okay, and right now we're not even concerned about what those answers actually are. We just want to be able to predict if something ends up as a positive answer or if something ends up as a negative answer. Now, when you're working with exponents, remember that not all of your base numbers are held inside parentheses. And this is something we've already gone over, but it's always worth going back to. So on the left, we see quantity negative 5 to the 4th power. That's not the same as negative 5 to the 4th power, or the opposite of 5 to the 4th power. Okay? Both of those are going to produce different answers, and they actually mean different things. So hopefully you remember that 5 to the 4th is going to be 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. That's 25 times 25. That's 625. But are we going to be dealing with a positive 625 or a negative 625? On the left, that quantity negative 5 to the 4th, that's going to produce a positive 625. On the right, that negative 5 to the 4th, or the opposite of 5 to the 4th, is going to produce a negative 625. And let's quickly talk about why, because this is something that you just have to fundamentally understand the difference between these two scenarios. Starting with the one on the left, when the base number is protected inside parentheses, then we are talking about replicating that number. So this one means negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. And then we can count up, is it an odd number of negatives or is it an even number of negatives? In this case, we have 4 negatives. 4 is an even number. It's going to produce a positive answer. And that's why we end up with the positive 625. Now looking over here at negative 5 to the 4th, or the opposite of 5 to the 4th, another way of expressing the opposite of 5 to the 4th would be negative 1 times 5 to the 4th. And that's really how you want to think about this guy, because this guy's an order of operations problem. And remember, in the order of operations, we're going to handle those exponents way before we handle the multiplication. Okay, so I've got to do this guy first and then multiply him by the negative. Okay, 5 to the 4th is 625. But I'm taking the opposite of that, which means I'm multiplying it by a negative 1. And that's how we end up with the negative 1 times 625 being negative 625. So please understand, when I have the parentheses around the base number, it's a different ball game than when there's just a negative out in front of the base number. And you're going to get a lot of practice with this. Okay, so have that pencil and paper ready now. We're going to go through some examples. And we'll start off kind of easy, but my job is to try to confuse you tonight. Don't back down from that confusion. Work your way through it and try to understand if you take a misstep somewhere. All right, so let's get into it. Go ahead and have your pencil and paper ready. These are some brief examples that do not involve exponents yet. Here we're just looking for, are we working with an odd number of negatives or an even number of negatives? And I want you to go ahead and come up with the correct answer. And the sign of your answer must be correct. So go ahead and hit pause now, and then we will reconvene to go over answers. Okay, in number 1, it looks like we have an even number of negatives. And so if all I'm doing is multiplying, if we don't have any addition or subtraction or any other business mixed in, then I can really focus on, okay, do we have an even number or an odd number? Here we have 2 negatives, so an even number of negatives. So I know for a fact that my answer is going to be positive, right? All right, so when you multiply this out, 16 times 3, 48, 48 times 2, 96, and I just said that the answer was going to be positive, so I can interpret that as a positive 96, which you all should have received. All right, let's take a look at number 2. In number 2, I have 1, 2, 3. I have 4 negative numbers, so I also know here that my answer is going to be positive because 4 is an even number. And when you multiply all of that out, 1/2 of 8 is 4. 4 times 5 is 20. 20 times 4. So we're talking about positive 80. All right, take a look down at number 3. Now I have 5 numbers, and of those 5 numbers, 3 of them are negative. So I see 3 negative signs, which means that my answer is going to be a negative number. And you can just do the multiplication really quickly. 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 4 is 24, 24 times 10, we're talking about negative 240. And I don't anticipate any issues with those, so just make sure that you're counting your negatives correctly. All right, let's go ahead and get some exponents involved now. Now, it's really important to me that you try these on your own first, and it's okay if you make a mistake, but you're going to learn from your mistake by maybe messing up if you're not understanding correctly the first time. So I do want you to do these before me. Go ahead and try 4, 5, 6, and 7. Have a reason for your answer and pay attention to the difference between having the parentheses around the base number or just a negative sign naked out there by itself in front of the base number. Big difference between those. Do these on your own first, and then we'll reconvene to go over answers. Okay, let's see how we did. Number 4, we are looking at the opposite of 3 squared. So remember, we want to interpret this as negative 1 times 3 squared. That's an order of operations problem. You have to do the exponents first. So that's negative 1 times 9. And then you're allowed to do the multiplication. So this ends up being a negative 9. Okay, now compare that with number 5. Same numbers, but here we have use of parentheses. And when we have those parentheses, we're going to replicate the negative 3. So this stands for negative 3 times negative 3. Now these can produce positive or negative answers. In this case, we have 2 negative numbers, which is an even number of negatives, and that's why this ends up being a positive 9. Okay, so hopefully you got both of those correct. Now let's take a look at numbers 6 and 7. In number 6, we see that parentheses structure, so we are replicating. This is negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. And I did want you to have 2 to the 5th memorized. Hopefully you have it memorized by now. 2 to the 5th is 32. The only question is, are we dealing with a positive 32 or a negative 32? Well, we have 5 negative signs. That's an odd number of negatives. So this guy is going to be negative 32. All right, what did you get on number 7? Did you get positive 32 or negative 32? Well, this one also ends up being this one also ends up being negative 32. This is the opposite of 2 to the 5th, so negative 1 times 2 to the 5th. Remember, you have to do the 2 to the 5th first. So that's 32, and we're taking the opposite of 32, so we're multiplying it by the negative 1. And that also produces negative 32. Okay, so you might have the same answer here for both 6 and 7, but it's the same answer, but for 2 very, very, very different reasons. And I want you to have the reasons dialed in, because if you don't, you won't be able to handle the more complex stuff, like the next set of examples. Okay, so good job on those, hopefully. And now you're going to apply what you learned in a harder context. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more challenging. Pencil and paper out, most definitely. You'll be turning these in to me tomorrow. Try them on your own first, and make sure you follow those order of operations. Go ahead and do them now, hit pause, and then we'll reconvene to go over answers. Okay, it's very easy to mess up on these. Let's see how you did. And if you make a mistake, that's okay. Just make sure you understand where your mistake's coming from and how to rectify it. If you look at number 8, I kind of see this as 3 different things going on. If we follow the order of operations, which you always want to have in the back of your mind, notice that the exponents, are going to come before, long before the addition and subtraction. So when you see that plus sign right here in the middle, you're not going to do anything with that plus sign until the very end of the problem. Really what you're going to do is simplify whatever this means and simplify whatever this means first, and then whatever you get, you're going to add both of those quantities together. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. So I'll begin with the negative 7 squared. Remember, that's the opposite of 7 squared. And the opposite of 7 squared is going to be negative 1 times 49. which is negative 49. So that guy on the left basically produces a negative 49. Okay. Now over here with the negative 5 cubed, since we have the parentheses, that's negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. So do we have a positive or a negative 125? Well, an odd number of negatives says I have a negative 125. What am I doing with these two numbers? Well, that's where the plus sign comes in. I'm going to add them. So you have an addition problem. Now, is this war or is it get mugged twice? You should recognize it as get mugged twice. You lose 49, you've lost 125. Altogether, you've lost 174. So give yourself a big pat on the back if you indeed got negative 174 for the first one of these. If not, that's okay. Now maybe you better understand the flavor of what we're doing. Number 9, see this plus sign here and this minus sign here. We're not going to touch those until the very end of the problem, which might be kind of confusing because you might notice this minus a negative over here and you might want to jump to change that to a plus sign, but you can't do addition and subtraction until the very end of the process. Okay, so we're going to focus on our exponents first and then follow through with the adding and subtracting. All right, let's start with the negative 2 to the 6th. Remember, that's going to be the opposite of 2 to the 6th. So negative 1 times 2 to the 6th. 2 to the 6th is 64, so that's negative 1 times 64. And I know that negative 1 times anything is going to be negative, so that's negative 64. That's what we get sort of in the first zone over there. Negative 4 cubed with the parentheses, remember, is going to be negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4. Okay, and that 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. Odd number of negatives, so we also have a negative 64. Now don't overthink this. Okay, sometimes you see the negative 64, negative 64. Maybe you're thinking that they cancel out. Don't even think about that stuff yet. We'll come back to the addition and subtraction and see what happens. All right, over here, I'm doing the negative 3 to the 4th. So that's negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. That's going to produce a positive answer, and that's going to be a positive 81. And let's see how all of these things are joined. So I'm going to bring down my plus sign because now I'm in the adding and subtracting phase. I've already gotten done with my exponents. I'm going to do the adding and subtracting from left to right. So I have to do these two guys first. Well, that's another get mugged twice problem. You lose 64, you lose 64, you've lost 128. So now I have negative 128 minus 81. And that's subtraction. Type 1 or type 2, well, that's type 1 subtraction. That turns into get mugged twice. So you lose 128, you lose 81. Altogether, you have lost 209. So hopefully you guys were able to come up with negative 209 for that one. If not, it's okay. You have a chance to redeem yourself. Let's look at the last two. Okay, so once again, you'll want to go ahead and try these on your own, and then we can reconvene to go over answers. Go ahead and hit pause now. All right, let's see how we did. Remember, some of you guys might see this minus a negative structure and want to change it into a plus sign, but you can't do that because we don't begin with addition and subtraction. We have to simplify those exponents first. So I'm going to be focusing on what this guy means, and I'm going to be focusing on what this guy means, and then I'll get those two quantities and subtract them. So let's begin with the opposite of 3 squared. Opposite of 3 squared is going to be negative 1 times 3 squared, which is negative 1 times 9, which is negative 9. You guys probably have that figured out by now. Okay, so we have a negative 9 on that side. Over here, negative 5 to the 4th. That's going to be negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. That's going to be a positive number, and that's going to be positive 625. And how are these two quantities joined? Well, they're joined by a minus sign. This is type 1 subtraction. You lose 9, you lose 625. You can already infer the get mugged twice in there if you change it to addition. So you lose 9, you lose 625, you have lost 634. So negative 634 is your answer for number 10. All right, number 11. I'll go through this one a little bit more quickly. Negative 2 quantity to the fourth. So that's going to be negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. That's going to be a positive 16. Negative 3 quantity cubed. It's going to be a negative 3 times a negative 3 times a negative 3. It gives me a negative 27. Plain old 4 squared is 4 times 4, which is 16. And then negative 5 quantity squared is negative 5 times negative 5, which is a positive 25. And then I'm just going to bring down my operations. So here I have the plus sign, here I have the plus sign, and then this one is a minus sign. And now I'm on the adding and subtracting phase. I do need to do these from left to right. That is the order of operations. So I'll begin here, 16 plus negative 27. That's a war problem. Negatives win, and they win by 11. And I'll drop down my remaining stuff. So negative 11 plus 16 minus 25. Okay, from left to right, I have another war problem here. Negative 11 plus 16. This time the positives win, and they win by 5. I'll drop down my remaining stuff, so we're left with 5 minus 25. Notice that that is type 1 subtraction. It's going to turn into 5 plus negative 25. War problem, negatives win. They win by 20. So you should feel really good if you were able to get either one of these correct, or maybe even both, which would be awesome. Okay. All right, so you always want to review the effect that those parentheses have on your base number. It's going to be the difference between you getting the right answer and you going down the wrong path, and that will actually have profound implications on down the line when we get into the harder topics in second semester. So practice, practice, practice on this stuff, and if you need some extra help, make sure you ask me in class tomorrow. All right, good job.